Hello there. Well, critics claim that the National Trust has shifted its focus away from conservation and heritage stewardship towards virtue signalling, wokeness and ideological priorities such as diversity, inclusion and re-examining Britain's colonial past. Now, the Trust insists that those claims are exaggerated, politically motivated or based on misinformation, and that its work on history and inclusion is part of responsible stewardship, not a replacement for conservation. So what's the truth? Has the National Trust sold out to cultural signalling whilst its heritage assets crumble around its ears? Or maybe it's just a storm in a teacup, driven by misinformation, conspiracy theories and fake news. Stay with us. Welcome to Grey Matters. Hello there, and welcome to Grey Matters, the channel that promotes the fact that the older generation still matters and looks at issues that matter to the older generation. And I think this does matter to the older generation because the National Trust, I would suggest, is propped up by our generation, the older generation, more so than the younger generations. And when you consider that the senior joint membership is around, I think, £128 a year, I stand to be corrected, that's a lot of money to find out of your pensions, and it's a lot of money if you think that it's not being used properly. The first question is the National Trust actually neglecting the assets under its care and stewardship? So let's find out. We'll start by seeing what triggered this row. Now, 6 years ago, in 2020, the National Trust published the I never get around saying this, Colonialism and Slavery Report. It was an academic work detailing links between 93 of its properties and colonialism and slavery. Now, this sparked some intense backlash from some MPs and media outlets who accused the Trust of denigrating British history and engaging in depthless virtue signalling. No more so than when Churchill was demonised when Chartwell was included in that list of 93 properties. Take a look at this clip.
Produced the interim report on the connections between colonialism and properties now in the care of the National Trust, in which it listed 93 properties that it is responsible for with links to slavery and colonialism. One of those properties was Chartwell, Winston Churchill's former home, and this has caused great anger to many of my constituents who see Winston Churchill as arguably the greatest Briton there ever was. Will my right honourable friend in government time find time for us to debate Churchill's legacy and the man that he was, and how we should be proud of him, and how we should push back upon the left's attempts and their determination to try and denigrate his past? And also, with my right honourable friend, take into account the concerns that many of us have about many of our once loved and currently loved national organisations being increasingly influenced and taken over by wokest elements.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely spot on. We should be so proud of our great heroes in this nation like Winston Churchill, and an organisation like the National Trust should be honoured that it has Chartwell amongst its portfolio of properties, and it should remember that its properties were given to it by people who expected them to be custodians of our history, to be proud of our history, and to think well of our great nation, not to be shamefacedly, quietly hiding away, pretending that they are abashed about the greatness that this country has enjoyed over so many centuries. And it is sad that a once great organisation, a membership organisation that owes a duty to its members, many of whom I hear are now resigning in protest, owes duty to its members, cannot realise how wonderful a man like Churchill was. And he is not alone. I could give a list of the great figures of our past, but Mr. Speaker, you want me to be brief.
Well, the organisation Restore Trust and some commentators claimed that the report was ideologically driven and unnecessary. The Trust countered that it was simply documenting established historical facts. But from what I recall, and I stand to be corrected, it wasn't that annoyed everyone. It was what the National Trust did about it, removing signs, replacing them with virtual apologies, removing paintings of patrons of famous historical figures in case anyone was offended, and so on. The National Trust claims that nothing was removed from public view for those reasons. Assets were either away on loan or with conservators. However, commentators have asked why it seemed to be only the potentially controversial exhibits that were away on loan or being restored. It makes you wonder. And the National Trust also seems to have got itself well and truly caught up in pride events, which had nothing to do with curating valuable and historical properties. Examples frequently cited by critics of this is asking volunteers at Ickworth House to wear rainbow lanyards during Pride Month, promoting plant-based menus in cafes, producing an inclusivity and well-being calendar that reportedly omitted Christian holidays. Now, these were held up as signs that the Trust was prioritising social messaging over heritage. However, let's face it, many establishments these days are promoting plant-based food, so I wouldn't read anything into that. And as for the calendar, it was apparently an internal tool for staff and didn't need to list Christmas and other holidays. But the problem is that the optics didn't help that, did they? And Restore Trust and other commentators argue that some houses are partially closed due to volunteer shortages, that conservation is being under-prioritised, and that membership fees have risen whilst access has decreased. And also that the Trust is focusing on irrelevant cultural issues instead of its statutory mission. And remember, statutory? Enshrined in law, in case you've forgotten what it means. Now, they claim that these link these concerns to a claimed loss of 89,000 members between 2023 and 24. And I suspect many more have left since then. And even some MPs have accused the Trust of straying from its purpose and of hectoring members. Nothing would turn me off more than turning up to somewhere like a National Trust house and having someone at the till trying to push some ideology onto me. But could that be, that most of its employees are anti-British? Now, that's not a rash statement by me. That comes from the boss, the Trust's Director General. Take a look at this from GB News.
Yes, the National Trust Director General has said something rather curious. She's admitted that 70% of the charity's staff are Union Jack-hating progressive activists. Yes, this was speaking at a Labour Party fringe event. The boss of the charity, Hilary McGrady, acknowledged that there was a gap between her staff's views and the views held by the wider public. So was she being honest?
Yeah. What do you make of that then? And of course, the National Trust strongly rejects the idea that it's neglecting its assets or is captured by ideology. Its communications team claims that woke accusations are often based on misinformation or cherry-picked examples. They say that objects said to be hidden because of slavery links were simply on loan elsewhere, and that most members care far more about conservation than culture war narratives. Yeah. I'm sure that's true, which is why they're leaving in droves. The Trust continues, they say, to manage everything from peat bogs to stately homes, a huge and varied portfolio. Well, the Trust also notes that it has successfully resisted attempts by Restore Trust to win seats on its governing council. Oh dear. Heaven forbid that there should be other voices on the council. To my mind, the National Trust doesn't seem to embrace the idea of alternative views and checks and balances. Multiple sources describe the National Trust as having become an unlikely front for the UK's wider culture wars. The debate is no longer just about heritage management, it's about how Britain should present its past. Well, truthfully, I would suggest, warts and all. It's also about whether institutions should acknowledge colonial history, and it's also about who gets to define our national identity. Certainly not the National Trust. This is widely recognised across reporting from The Guardian, Prospect, Politics Home and others. So is the National Trust neglecting its assets? Well, According to reporting, there's no evidence that conservation work has been abandoned, but there are staff shortages, some reduced opening hours, rising costs, and member dissatisfaction about priorities. And what are those priorities? Well, in the context of this subject, the dissatisfaction that stands out is the belief that the National Trust is prioritising social or political messaging over conservation. Now, these themes appear repeatedly in member reviews and AGM debates, which should surely suggest there must be some truth behind them. Critics interpret these as signs that the National Trust has been distracted by woke ideologies. The Trust attributes them to post-pandemic pressures, funding realities and misrepresentation of its policies. However, there is one aspect that's not open to misinterpretation, and that's the National Trust's own mission statement. The tone and emphasis of its public mission language has changed over the last decade. The older wording, pre-2015, which I would suggest is what everyone thinks the National Trust is about, emphasised preserving historic buildings, protecting landscapes, maintaining collections and providing public access. Now, however, it includes language about different histories, different cultures, ideas of a million minds, whatever that means, and a movement that reaches across time and place. Good grief. So let's look at them. Different histories? No. The National Trust is supposed to safeguard our history. Other countries have got their own heritage organisations to look after their histories. The National Trust doesn't need to get involved. And dare I suggest, most of those countries are probably former colonies. Next we have different cultures. Now, if that's about the histories of different cultures, then I refer back to my previous comment. It's not down to the National Trust to historically prioritise those cultures over our own. And then we have that weird phrase, ideas of a million minds. Well, if those millions of minds were giving the National Trust help with looking after its existing assets, like repairing roofs and conserving paintings, then that would be great. But I suspect it's far more diverse and probably divisive than we'd like. And finally, there's that real gobbledygook phrase, a movement that reaches across time and place. Again, what the heck does that mean? Thankfully, the National Trust still mentions preservation and conservation in its formal mission and values, but that public-facing language has shifted, and this newer wording, emphasising culture stories and inclusivity far more prominently than preservation or culture, is the root of the controversy. And at the same time, the updated values removed several references to history, replacing them with culture. It removed references to the countryside, adding imagery of multicultural celebrations and urban tower blocks, and added the slogan, "Together we thrive." Flipping heck. In the face of this alone, I have to say I'm not convinced by the National Trust's position on this issue, and neither is the media. Take a look at these two clips from Talk Radio TV.
Home, what's wrong with these people?
What's wrong with them, indeed? It's just part of a trend, as far as I can see, Kevin, for certain institutions, a lot of institutions in the UK, to be wokeified, for want of a better word, to see British history and British countryside as somehow a source of shame. So you get government reports, Welsh government reports, DEFRA reports saying the countryside is a racist. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous, Kevin? And then you have British history, of course, must be a source of shame because by definition, anything prior to about 1960 is not multiracial and not multicultural enough. So you get Churchill's statue being abused and vandalised. You get street names being changed.
I want to talk now about the National Trust. The charity has recently updated its values to prioritise embracing the traditions of different cultures. It has removed several references to history and instead put culture, while several references to the evil, horrible word countryside have been stripped away. Now, you might think that it's about old houses and having a nice cup of tea and a scone afterwards. No, together we thrive. We all need nature. It's a matter of survival, apparently. We all need culture. It's what humans do. The organisation now says we collectively represent a cause that's bigger than just ourselves or one property. It's about caring for nature and culture everywhere. They've had a video showing Hindus celebrating the Spring Festival of Holi at Corfe Castle in 2024. I mean, that's fair enough, I suppose, but really, is that what the National Trust is about? Also, a mural featuring who else but Benjamin Zephaniah, the poet, I use the term loosely, who's sadly no longer with us. It stresses the sense of the Trust as a movement, includes a fleeting image of a climate protest. Among the crowd is a woman holding up a sign saying, "Capitalism kills." The voiceover adds, "What we can do together, we could never do alone." Why don't they just look after some old houses?
Yeah. Well, I've never been a member of the National Trust. We were with English Heritage until their fees became unaffordable. Before that, we were members of the New Zealand Heritage Organisation because it also gave us access to New Zealand and English heritage here in the UK. But that's changed now. I think they caught on to the fact that people were using them just to get cheaper entrance fees here. But what that did was to enable us, with the money we were saving, to support the sites locally by buying merchandise, which we could never afford to do before. So tell me, what do you think about this? Are you a member? Have you ever been a member? Do you or did you work for the National Trust? If so, please join in the debate. Your insights would be really useful. And who do you believe so far? Are you swayed by the National Trust responses? Do share your comments and your views, please, in the comments section below. I'm very pleased to hear what you've got to say. So that's it for now. Disappointing. I would love to believe the National Trust, but I'm afraid they seem to be contradicting themselves in various ways, and I don't actually believe them at all. Thank you for joining us. Do subscribe if you haven't already, if you think our content is up your alley, and give it a nice thumbs up. Don't forget you can hype the video for the first 7 days after it's published if you're on a mobile device. And until the next time we see you and we speak together, thank you for joining us, and it's bye for now.